So I finally animated the evolution of Iron Man on the main channel, which should be linked down below, and you know what that means? Time to rank the Iron Man trilogy itself, from worst to first. This is probably going to be a shorter ranking than normal since it's only 3 films, but I'll probably follow it up with a ranking of the Avengers films later on, so stay tuned for that. With that said, let's get to the rankings, and if you have your own ranking, feel free to share it down below. And easily coming in third place for me is Iron Man 3. That's not to say I think that this is a horrible movie or anything. I actually have quite a bit of fun with it. I just think that it's a little messy in places and it tonally shifts from comedy to trying to be dark a little too much. But let's first go through what's good about the movie. First of all the Iron Suit designs are really great. The setup for the movie and everything leading up to his house being destroyed is pretty awesome. I really like how it deals with his PTSD and examines how he uses his iron suits as both an armor physically and as a crux emotionally, and him shedding those suits at the end just kind of completes his arc through this trilogy, which unfortunately leads to the bad because him shedding his Iron Man armors feels like such a definitive ending to his character and his arc that him coming back in Age of Ultron with the armors and little explanation as to why kind of hurts this film, and it's also bogged down with a middle chunk where he's paired with this kid that feels somewhat out of place when compared to the beginning and the ending, and also is like feels really slow. A lot of movies kind of suffer from the second act being the worst, and this one has that same kind of deal. Although the worst offense may be how they treated the character of the Mandarin, or should I say Trevor, which works really well as like a twist in the movie, but hurts the rewatchability because all of a sudden you go from showcasing this really powerful villain to turning him into a joke. And then you're left with Aldrich Killian and his cronies, which don't really live up to the threat that was promised with the Mandarin. With that said, the movie still works, it's just a little bit clunky and the weakest of the batch. Okay, so coming in second place is going to be Iron Man 2, which builds pretty well on the first film and does the typical sequel thing of doubling the villains, while also giving Tony a sidekick, War Machine, whose armor is actually pretty sweet in this film, as well as an ally in Black Widow, and this is probably my favorite look for her throughout all of the series. That long deep red hair look it's something. Other positives from the movie are the opening and closing scenes, which involve Tony being cocky in front of the senators and the congressmen who are trying to take his suits away, and then at the end he gets awarded by them. I also really like the Whiplash. I think he's a good villain, mainly because of Mickey Rourke's performance. And I also think that Justin Hammer comes off as a good villain for Tony on the intellectual level, and shows off just how other billionaires just kind of like want to emulate what Tony is doing, but they just can't quite get it right. Although that sort of leads to the I can hear my cat in the background. Anyway, so that sort of leads to the negatives of the film, where you really don't get enough Whiplash throughout the film. You see him in the opening fight with Tony at the racetrack, and you see him in the ending, although the rest of the time he's just kind of cooped up with Justin Hammer making his drones. This is especially annoying when he's only seen for about 1 minute in the end battle. Also, parts where Tony is being poisoned by his own arc vector feels a little shoehorned in, and he solves it a little too easily. Although, all in all, I think this movie is pretty solid. It's more consistent for me than Iron Man 3, and I think the villains are stronger, so that's why it comes in at second place instead of third. So now, of course, on to first place, and if you can do math and remember which films I talked about before, you'll know which one comes in at number 1, and it's of course Iron Man 1. Somehow this film manages to work and function completely on its own, while also setting up the seeds of what was to come for the MCU. Robert Downey Jr.'s performance as Tony was basically iconic from the opening scene, and shot both him and the character Iron Man to the superstardom levels that were was unseen for the character before that. Like, he had been in cartoons and stuff before, and I remember watching them as a kid, but like he was never like on par with like Batman or Spider-Man or Superman, which he probably still isn't, but he's damn near close now. I also think Obadiah Stane is probably the best and most well-rounded villain of all his main films here. It works mostly because Tony knew him before he turned evil, whereas the other villains in the sequels, they didn't really know him, and we don't really see them before they're already evil. And I also really like the relationship that Tony builds with Yinsen in the beginning of the movie, and while it's become kind of a trope throughout the comic book movies, where they spend time with this person, this like mentor who like helps them, and then as soon as they're kind of done their part of the story, they just kind of kill them off. But I think it works really well here. The ending scene where Tony's saying goodbye to him still hits me in the feels. And then there's like the scene before, which I think it must be a reference to the original Star Wars movie, where he's like running and charging, and then he sees all the people with guns. It reminds me a lot of the Han Solo scene, Stormtroopers, which could make sense since this one and the second one are directed by Jon Favreau, who is now actually working on the Mandalorian show. Now, what's a little bit distracting for this one, which isn't this movie's fault, but more or less the sequels, but Obviously the character of Rhodey is played by Terrence Howard here, instead of Don Cheadle, which isn't a knock on this film. I think Howard actually does a pretty good job in the performance. It just kind of irks me that they couldn't keep him on board for consistency's sake. But altogether, this is one of my favorite MCU films, and definitely my favorite of the 3 Iron Man films. So, what do you think? Does my list hit the mark, or is it not worth a cheeseburger after being trapped in a cave? Feel free to leave your own ranking down below, and check out the evolution of Iron Man on the main channel. I've had a lot of nice comments from everybody over there. It's really nice and heartening to spend so much time working on a video, and then to have it kind of pay off and just see you guys enjoying it. So I'm really happy about that. So you can go check it out if you haven't already. And I also want to thank my patrons for supporting my main channel and allowing me to do these other ventures as well. This time I want to thank 53XY83457 and Fergus for joining the Patreon recently. If you'd like to support the main channel and in turn this channel, there's a link in the description, I'm sure, and you can become a Tell It Animated hero as well. Although I'm not charging while COVID is ravaging the world, it just doesn't feel right to do that right now. But until next time, I've been Aaron, and I'll tell you something later.